No one admits to being afraid of death. In the books and stories, people mock death and pretend that to die is a small thing. Well, I am afraid of death. Of the death of my body, of the death of my soul, of the death coming to find me now, on the gypsy field. My dad went to school, my school, 20 years ago. When he's had a few drinks, he tells me what it was like in the olden days. I've made it sound like a rough school now, but back then it was worse. The biggest difference was that the teachers used to hit the kids all the time. There were 3 ways of getting hit, my dad said. The basic way was just getting slapped hard on the face. Dad said it was okay if they just came up and slapped you, but sometimes you'd be mucking about and a teacher would be behind you, and so you couldn't see the slap coming, and it would hit you out of the blue. The next step up was being hit with the edge of a ruler on the back of the hand. Dad said there's a special ruler in each class, and it had a steel edge and was as heavy as a wrench. You had to hold out your hand, knuckles up, and the teachers, if they were cruel, would leave you waiting for 2 minutes, until your hand started to shake and you couldn't stop it, he said. Didn't matter how hard you were. He said sometimes they'd make do with that, the teachers, making you tremble. And that was quite bad, but not as bad as when they went through with it, and really let you have it. He said it hurt so much the world would go black for a couple of seconds. And sometimes the kid would wet his pants, but my dad said he never did. It would leave a row of blue lumps topped by a spot of blood across your fingers, near where they joined to your hand. Dad said that you could get it for virtually nothing. For forgetting to bring something to school, for not being in a straight line, for smiling when you should have had a face of stone, for having a face of stone when you should have been smiling. But the top of the range was the cane, the long whippy stick of bamboo. Even then there were variations, backside or hand. Dad said that getting the cane on the hand actually hurt the most, but it somehow wasn't half as bad as having to bend over a chair, feeling as helpless as a worm on a pavement and taking it on the arse. Dad said that kids always boasted when they got caned on the hand, but when it was on the arse, they just shut up, and nothing could get them to talk about it. They can't hit you now, the teachers, You can tell that some of them want to, some of them really want to. You can see their jaws working little circles with the effort of not hitting you. But they can do other things. One of the things they can do is humiliate you. If you shame and degrade a kid, you know the other kids will do the rest for you. For some reason, the teachers never seem to bother much with the hard kids, the troublemakers. The ones they hate are the quiet ones. Not just any of the quiet ones, but the quiet ones who aren't interested in them. The ones who are always looking into themselves. The lost kids. The freaks. Yeah, you got it. Shane and his gang. I never got why the teachers hated them. Maybe it's because people don't like it when they aren't in on the secret, and the freaks went around like they had it. The big secret, the one we all want to know. The best example of a teacher who loved humiliation, who relished and ate it like some sickly delicacy, Turkish delight or marzipan, was Mrs. Eel. After break, after my talk with Ross, I had French with her, and Mrs. Eel taught French to the kids who weren't very good at French, and I think that pissed her off. You learn pretty quickly to be careful around her. A big mistake was calling her Miss rather than Mrs. Eel. The way she'd react, well, you'd think her called her a mad bitch or something. Another mistake was to find whatever exercise she had set too easy or too hard. If you made a mistake like that, she would talk quietly to begin with, so you strained to hear what she was saying, and then suddenly she'd scream, and her eyes would be insane, and sometimes a little bit of spit would fly out. Other days, she'd just be bored, and then she'd pick on someone for no reason at all, some pathetic loner, some harmless wisp of a boy, or a shy girl struggling to come to terms with her body, or a fat kid, or one riddled with acne. Having found herself a victim, she would spend the entire lesson mauling him or her with feline grace it was hard not to admire. And the worst thing was that she would draw the rest of us into it. I went into the class with my head down. Mrs. Eel was sitting behind her desk, with her back to the class, and her feet up on the windowsill. That was bad news. The class was all right, meaning there weren't any kids there to be scared of. Just Mrs. Eel. But there was one thing about the class, I sort of said it earlier. That girl was in it, the one who got hit by the football. Getting hit by the ball was typical of Maddie Bray. She was unlucky. The most unlucky thing about her was how she looked. I mean, how she looked combined with her name. Bray isn't a beautiful name, and maybe someone called Bray is always going to get some stick. But if you're called Bray and you have a long, horsey face, then you're in trouble. You know that thing you can do when you have to put everyone you know, or everyone who comes through a door into one of two groups? Currant bun or horse? Currant bun means round face, horse means long face. Well, Maddie was definitely horse. But that makes her sound worse than she was, because horse can go either way. I mean, sometimes horse can be bad, but sometimes it could be good. Currant bun is usually in the middle somewhere. I don't think you could say that Maddie was beautiful to look at, but there was something about her face that made you want to look at it, that made you want to stare. And I don't mean the way you would look at something terrible, some really bad birthmark. It was just a feeling that you could never quite get to the bottom of her face. Sorry, that sounds stupid. I don't know what I mean, really, except that her face was something I found it hard not to look at. Like I said, Maddie was in the Shane gang, but she wasn't good at it, being a freak, that is. She never got the look quite right. She was tight where she should have been baggy, and baggy where she should have been tight. And she knew this, knew that she wasn't there, but didn't know enough to put it right. She was so conscious of her failings that she spoke to almost no one, and moved silently, like a shadow, through the school, looking at nothing but her own big feet. Maddie was clever, or at least she was in the top set for most things, so I don't know how she ended up in Mrs. Eel's class with me. I suppose you can't be good at everything. But the trouble was, even if she wasn't great at French, she was better than the rest of us, and that was a dangerous thing with Mrs. Eel. And so Mrs. Eel loathed her. Someone who knew all about what goes on inside other people's heads might say that she hated her because she feared she might be a little bit like her. And that can be reason enough for hating if you're afraid of what you might be. And someone with a simpler view of things might say that she hated her because she was a hating person, and that asking why Mrs. Eel hated Maddie Bray was like asking why a kid likes the taste of sugar. All year I'd winced and squirmed as Mrs. Eel tortured Maddie. She'd make her read out the most difficult passages that no one else in the class could have gotten anywhere with. And Maddie would struggle through with Mrs. Eel not just correcting her every word, actually laughing at her, laughing in her face. And there were other slyer tricks. There was a kid in the class called Mark Hampson, who stank of piss. I don't know why he stank of piss. He didn't look dirty. He usually looked quite smart, in fact. Maybe he was a bit wetter or something. Mrs. Eel made us sit in alphabetical order. Quite a few teachers did it, as a way of making sure you couldn't sit next to your friends. About halfway through the first term, by which time she'd worked out that both Hampson stank and that she hated Maddie Bray, she changed the system so that it started based on your first name, which meant Maddie and Mark were together. It was little touches like this that made Mrs. Eel special. Attention to detail, I suppose you'd call it. I was sitting at the back of the class, keeping my profile low, Mrs. Eel had written up an exercise on the whiteboard. She hadn't even spoken to us, but just waved at the board. My mind wasn't on the class. It never was. But now I had more to think about than usual. The chewing gum in my hair, the train's talk with Roth. Then, out of the corner of my eye, I saw Mrs. Eel was starting to fidget, leaning her chin first on her right hand, then on her left. I guessed that this meant trouble, and I slipped further down into my chair. And then I saw Mrs. Eel fix her gaze on Mattie Bray. Mattie had finished the exercise, and had made a mistake of putting her pen down. A little smile flickered across Mrs. Eel's mouth, like a cockroach skittering across the lino. "So, finished already, Mattie?" She said her words hardly a whisper. She had managed to make the word Mattie sound like something you'd scrape off your shoe. "Yes, Mrs. Eel." That was lucky, sort of. "It would seem we're not really stretching you in this class, are we?" "No, yes, Miss Eel." "Perhaps we're boring you?" The rest of the class was alert now, aware that something was happening, and I sensed the general relief that it was happening to an outsider, this half-emo girl. "Bray?" "Yes, Mrs. Eel?" "Do you know the French for donkey?" "No, Mrs. Eel." "Do you know the French word for the sound a donkey makes?" "No, Mrs. Eel." "Can you make a sound like a donkey?" "No, Mrs. Eel." "Yes, you can, Bray." Please, Mrs. Eel, don't." "Make a sound like a donkey, Bray." "Please, Bray, what does a donkey look like, Bray?" "Don't know, Mrs. Eel." "Look in the mirror, Bray." All sounds a bit lame. You forget the power of humiliation. You don't realize what a gift this was to the class. Ah, assholes. But more than that, all of us were sucked in by the teacher's dominance and contempt. The class was half loving it. It was a Christian thrown to the lions, and we were the people of Rome cheering on each bite. Except there wasn't any cheering, just silent glee. I couldn't stand it. There were kids in the class who might have deserved that kind of treatment, but not poor long-faced Mattie Bray. And I think I still had some leftover anger from what happened to me earlier. Anger mixed up with embarrassment from not having done anything about it, and then feeling overpowered by Ross. If I'd been a different kind of person, I might have been able to say something funny or clever to make it stop. But that's not me. I'm not funny or clever. So I did something else. I didn't know what it was going to be until I started doing it. Although the truth is, it was something I'd dreamed about before, as a way of escaping. I'd even looked it up on the internet, seen some photos, even a couple of short video sequences. So, I fell off my chair. Then I started shaking, really shaking. I didn't have any way of making my mouth foam, and drooling seemed way too gross, so I kept my mouth clamped shut, like that was part of it. My arms were rigid by my sides, and I tried to make the shaking seem like some terrible, irresistible force that I was fighting against. I sensed the commotion all around me. There were screams and shouts and the noises people making when they were faintly disgusted, but also fascinated. I heard Mrs. Eel, her voice high with indignation and anger. I'd ruined it for her, ruined her fun with Mattie Bray. "Get back, let me see," she said. "Has he done this before?" "No, miss." "What did you say?" "No, Mrs. Eel. Really sorry, Mrs. Eel. It was him freaking out like that." Then I thought I'd done enough. I stopped twitching and just lay there. "He stopped, Mrs. Eel." "I can see that, you stupid girl." Peter, can you hear me?" "His name is Paul, Mrs. Eel." There was a small silence. I imagined the look that Mrs. Eel was sending out. "Paul! Paul!" I felt her hand on my shoulders. She began to shake me. That probably wasn't the recommended treatment for an epileptic. I groaned. "Mrs. Eel, we should put him in the recovery position." I recognized the voice. It was Mattie Bray's. "Well, Go on then, girl! I was on my back. I felt new, softer hands on me, rolling me over, moving my legs. I felt her breath on my cheek. I opened my eyes. Her face was so close. It covered everything. When she saw my eyes, she looked startled for a second. And then, at long last, after all these years, I did the right thing. Did a cool thing. I winked. And Mattie Bray smiled quickly back at me. She shared my secret. She knew what I'd done.